there is very good evidence that when people think about when they're about to do something, they're about to engage in a task that has ethical implications, they do better, meaning that they behave more ethically if they keep in mind a role model.
Can you make politicians philosophers? Indeed, can you make anyone, including yourself, more virtuous? Perhaps it's time to demand more of our leaders and to keep them accountable. But how? Hello, this is Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom, a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. You can now find us, along with our free newsletter, at classicalwisdom.substack.com. Today's Classical Wisdom Speaks podcast is with Massimo Pigliucci, the K.D. Irani Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York and author of many books, including How to Be a Stoic, Using Ancient Philosophy to Live a Modern Life, and most recently, How to Be Good, What Socrates Can Teach Us About the Art of Living Well. But before we begin, a quick thank you to our Classical Wisdom Society members who make this podcast possible. If you would like to become a society member and help support the classics, please go to classicalwisdom.substack.com and have a read. You can also help us out by clicking the subscribe button on your YouTube channel and enjoying our monthly dose of classical wisdom. Now, on to the quest for character, for ourselves, for our society, and most definitely for those in charge.
And I really love the concept of your book. I think it's really interesting. It kind of delves into a really important topic from maybe a not obvious standpoint. Right. And so it's you've written A Quest for Character, Seeking Virtue, and it's primarily drawing on this very fascinating history between Socrates and Alcibiades. And I really want to get into the virtue and the politics and the philosophy, but I think we should just make sure everybody's on the same page. And all of our listeners are up to date on their knowledge of Alcibiades and his relationship with Socrates. So maybe you can start us off with a quick recap of these two absolutely interesting, fascinating people in history.
Sure. Well, I assume that most people have heard of Socrates. So, most famous, arguably, philosopher, not only in ancient Greece, but possibly of all times. He was living during a very interesting period in Greek history, during the middle of the Peloponnesian War, which eventually led to the destruction of Athens, to the defeat of Athens by the Spartans. And Alcibiades was Socrates' friend, Socrates' student, and Socrates' rumored lover, although that rumor apparently is not true, because in Plato's Symposium, Alcibiades himself complains about the fact that he couldn't get actually to have sex with Socrates as much as he wanted to, because Socrates was interested in the intellectual and virtuous aspects, but not in the physical ones, apparently. So Alcibiades was an incredible character. I am honestly stunned that nobody's made a movie out of his life yet. He was, at the time that we're talking about, he was young, brash, courageous, handsome, rich, anything you wanted really in a man or in a human being, he was it. Unfortunately, however, he was also full of hubris. He had a very high opinion of himself, which of course was, to some extent justified by his accomplishments in life, even early on. And so the book starts out with an interesting conversation between Socrates and Alcibiades. And this is recalled in a dialogue called the Alcibiades Mire, which is usually attributed to Plato, though scholars are not sure whether actually Plato wrote it or somebody else in Plato's circles. It doesn't matter. The point is, the dialogue is very instructive, because we have a young Alcibiades, he's 20 years old, and he goes to Socrates, his mentor, who is about 40 at that time. And Alcibiades says, look, I want to be leading Athens. I want to be, I want to get into politics. I want to become, somebody who really makes a difference for our city. But I realize that I need your guidance. I need virtue. I need to figure out how to actually do things, which is very good for a 20-year-old,
impressive,
right?
Yeah.
No, it was impressive. So they start talking, and Socrates says, "Okay, well, let's take a look here. What are your motivations? What do you want to do? How you prepared for this?" And it turns out that unfortunately, Alcibiades' motivations are not the right ones. He's really into self-aggrandizing and this quest for glory and all that sort of stuff. He's not very concerned about his character or about doing the right thing. So much so that by the end of the dialogue, Socrates says, Alcibiades, the problem with you and a lot of other politicians, in fact, he says most other politicians, is that you suffer from a particular type of stupidity, my friend. And he uses the Greek word amatia, which really actually translates as unwisdom or lack of wisdom. So the opposite of Sophia, right? The opposite of philosophy, the love of wisdom, is Alcibiades, somebody who's actually lacking wisdom. And he says, and that's the problem with you and people like you, is that you want to do a good thing, but in fact, you'll end up causing disaster. And this is prophetic on Socrates' part, because in fact, Alcibiades turned out to have a major hand in the fall of Athens, over the next 20 years or so. So that dialogue sets up these interesting question of what should be the relationship between ethics, especially personal ethics at a level of personal character, and politics. And we're still stuck with that question today, 2,400 years later.
Yeah, I always think of that in a way, the difference between a statesman and a politician, that this idea of these politicians use so much of their own egos to get ahead, as opposed to somebody who may genuinely care about the future of the country or city-state.
Correct. And that's exactly Socrates' point. Now, Socrates does admit that there are some people, they're rare, but there are some people who actually do care about the polis, and they do go into politics with good intentions, with the right intentions. But unfortunately, they're the minority. And another unfortunate thing is that most people are actually taken in by the Alcibiades kind of character, right? By the dashing, brash young man, or by the person who makes lots of promises that he cannot possibly deliver. We call those demagogues today, right? We still have issues with demagoguery or populism in the negative sense of the word. So in part, what I conclude by the end of the book is that, in fact, we bear our part of responsibility, because, it's easy enough to say, oh, I don't trust politicians, or that politician is bad, etc. Yeah, but what are you doing about it? And why is that politician there? After all, you or somebody like you did vote for him, if we're talking about a democracy, of course. So to some extent, it is in fact our collective problem, and we're not going to solve it just by looking for a miraculous answer. We need to start working at a personal level, one by one. And of course, that starts with working on ourselves, on our own character and judgment, before we can go out and criticize other people.
So do you think there's something to be said about a society, or the state of a society, especially with regards to virtue, if somebody as unvirtuous as Alcibiades is popular? And I mean, it's always handy to show that these things are relevant in modern situation, but there are plenty of unvirtuous people who are in great deal of power, and they're popular. So it's got to say something about why people are taken in by these characters. And does that reflect badly?
Right. That's right. It does reflect badly on us. And I think that a major part, you're absolutely right. Of course, we have plenty of examples in modern time, both in democracies and outside of democratic countries, of the kinds of people that Alcibiades represents, the kind of people that go after their own self-aggrandizing and all that, but they're narcissistic, etc. But they don't seem to care about the only thing that they should be caring about, which is the commonwealth, right? Now, part of the problem here is, I think, that we have, especially in modern times, we have really stopped caring about character. We have gotten to the point where we're so cynical about politics in general that we allow, paradoxically, we allow behaviors in our politicians that even a few years ago, let alone a few decades or centuries ago, would have been completely unacceptable. And we we brush them off as yet more confirmation of our own cynicism toward politics, right? So it's a vicious self-reinforcing circle. We stopped caring about character, and therefore then we are disgusted when it turns out that the people who lead us don't have good character, right? At some point, we need to stop that cycle. And I suspect that the best way to stop that cycle is, in fact, to start caring again about character, and particularly about our own. This is not the kind of recipe that will solve the situation, solve problems immediately. And unfortunately, one of the other problems with especially modern societies is that we want solutions and we want them now. Right? Yes. Unless we get them now, we give up. We become cynical, or we become dismissive. I mean, think about climate change, right? Climate change is the kind of issue that requires worldwide coordination and decades of work. But of course, decades of work is well beyond an electoral cycle. You know, politicians don't think in terms of decades; they think in terms of a year or two at a time, and it's even beyond most people's lifetime. Right? You know, I'm 58 in the moment. Very likely, the worst effects of climate change will not affect me personally, although they will affect my daughter, for instance. But it's difficult for us to think long term, to really care about what's going to happen 30, 50, 70 years down the road. Unfortunately, however, when we have problems of that magnitude, be they external problems such as climate change, or internal problems such as the wrong types of politicians in charge, the answer is not simple, and it will take time. There's no shortcut.
Yeah, I mean, I remember once reading an article advocating for, in some ways, how a benevolent monarch is one of the better political systems, because they actually care generations down. They have like a dynasty and it's a family name. And so that's a way that they can care beyond the 4 years or 6 years or whatever.
Sure. And who wouldn't want to be, in a state that is led by a Marcus Aurelius? The problem is then Marcus Aurelius had Commodus as a son, and he was a tyrant. that's the problem with
he didn't just continue. Yeah, I don't know why he didn't continue with the system of adopting somebody rather than just having your own. No, that's fascinating, and it's good to know what, as individuals, we can do. But I'd like to bring it back to your book and the quest for character with regards to finding these virtuous politicians. And you kind of started off with an excellent question: can we make ourselves better human beings? But since this kind of all relates to the relationship between Socrates and Alcibiades, I think that the second question you ask is, can we make others better human beings, and in particular leaders? Is that a possibility?
Right. And that's a great question to ponder. Now, Socrates thought about this 2,400 years ago. Can we teach virtue? And actually, his answer is kind of ambivalent. In one of the Platonic dialogues, the Meno, he says no. He says, well, I don't see any teachers of virtue, do you? So it must be that nobody can teach it. Even if it's possible to teach it in theory, I don't see any teachers around. But then in the Protagoras, which is interestingly a dialogue with a major sophist, Socrates changes his mind. And he says, all right, I guess virtue is a type of techne. It's a type of technical skill that can be learned, right? But the problem is it takes time. And it is Protagoras, in fact, in that dialogue makes an interesting analogy. He says, look, imagine that the survival of our nation depended on everybody playing the flute. What would you do? You would start a national program to teach music, right? Now, of course, you would know from the get-go that some people will excel. They would be, so good that they could be playing the Philharmonic or whatever it is. Most people won't be that good. In fact, some people will be awful. But you will know that because it is being taught, everybody will be getting better than they were to begin with. The same, the implication goes for virtue. There may be some people who are naturally good and pro-social, and for whom it doesn't really take much of an effort to be that way. And then there are others, I would say the majority of us, who struggle to become better human beings. But if we had training, just like in music or in athletics or any other skill, then you would get better. And so the question is, why don't we train people? One of the things that we don't teach in school is precisely practical philosophy. It's precisely ethics, is precisely the kind of skill that we arguably need far more than any other skill. You know, other technical theoretical skills like math or science or literature are important, but they're definitely not as important as trying to make everybody a better human being. That you would think that our priorities would be completely different from what they actually are, but as you know,
I guess I guess historically people would have felt that that was the role of religion, the church, and
right.
You know, that you have Sunday school and that's when you would do those sort of things.
Right. That's an interesting point, however. So this is because Christianity, especially in the West, since Christianity took over so completely over the last 2,000 years, that we have this notion that, yeah, it's up to religion. But of course, Socrates was alive before Christianity. And at the time of Socrates, it was philosophers who were supposed to do that. Now, the sophists went around claiming that they could teach virtue, right, among other things. Now, Socrates was a little skeptical about the sophists in particular, but interestingly, in the Protagoras, it is a sophist that changes Socrates' mind about this issue. So I would argue that actually better than religion, philosophers are in that position. But by philosophers, I don't mean an academic philosopher, somebody with a PhD that spends most of his time, you know, working on a very specialized topic, such as myself. I mean a lover of wisdom. You know, Socrates' novel approach and novel idea in ancient Athens was that the most important thing that we can do is to become lovers of wisdom, and everyone can become a lover of wisdom. Again, some will succeed better than others, but we can all do it.
No, I love that. It's one of our missions here at Classical Wisdom is to encourage just the seeking of wisdom. And it is very interesting, of course, to imagine that, of course, in the day and age of Socrates, religion wouldn't be the bastion of virtue. I mean, who's going to learn virtue from Zeus or the Olympians? I mean,
Exactly.
it's horrible things. They're a manual of what not to do. So it is interesting. It's nice to think of it being in a secular place, though, because then it can be shared with different communities in our sort of international world. So what would be one of the best ways to impart virtue? And it's something I've always thought as well, is what role does empathy have in this too?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it turns out that there is evidence. You know, part of my background is in science, and so I always look not just at the Greco-Romans, which I think were incredible in terms of their insights into human psychology and wisdom, but at the same time, you know, more than 2 millennia passed, and we've discovered a thing or two, and so it's always a good idea to look at what modern science, in particular cognitive science and social psychology, tell us about what works and what doesn't work. And for instance, there is a book that came out a few years ago by a social scientist named Christian Miller, and the title of the book is The Character Gap, and which looks into the evidence in some details. And it turns out that we begin to figure out that some things work and other things don't work. One thing that doesn't work, for instance, is to tell people that they're virtuous, that they're good. You know, there's, especially in the United States over the last several years, that there's been this trend of telling kids that they're good even if they're not, or they're brilliant even if they're not. You know,
everybody wins a prize.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it turns out that's a really bad idea. It backfires for all sorts of reasons. There's pretty good empirical evidence at this point that kids become complacent. They don't develop the right motivations, because the right motivation should be one of wanting to improve and wanting to seek truth, not to be praised. That actually feeds narcissism and not virtue. You know, that sort of stuff. So that's one thing that doesn't work. Another thing that doesn't work is to just wait around until you become wiser. So we're told that, oh, you get older and you become wiser. Well, no, not necessarily. It is true that wisdom increases with age, but only if you actually pay attention to your own experiences, if you reflect critically and learn from your experiences, if you just sit back and relax and just let time pass, that doesn't work either. The kind of things that do work, interestingly, are the kinds of things that the ancient Stoics were actually going around telling people they should do. For instance, picking a role model. There is very good evidence that when people think about where they're about to do something, they're about to engage in a task that has ethical implications, they do better, meaning that they behave more ethically if they keep in mind a role model. And the role model can be Socrates, but can also be your grandmother. So think about, the next time you're making a hard decision or a decision that has ethical consequences, think about what would my grandmother do about this? What would she say about this kind of stuff? That actually works. There is an incredible amount of evidence that shows that picking role models and sticking with role models actually does work. Another thing that works is critical self-reflection through means such as personal diaries. Think Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, right? That was a personal philosophical diary of self-reflection and self-criticism. Not self-criticism in the sense of bashing yourself, on the back, and it's like, oh no, I'm really bad, That doesn't help. That's not very useful. We're talking about analytical self-criticism. We're talking about taking a distance from what you've done during a particular day and ask yourself, well, why did I act this way? How could I be acting better the next time that something like that happens? So going a little bit more analytical, not yielding to emotion. So turns out there are techniques that we can teach other people and train other people in. Now imagine, for instance, just for a second, if we had, let's say, middle schools and high schools, where instead of telling kids, oh yeah, you're doing fine, you're doing great, you're great no matter what, you actually taught them to keep a regular philosophical diary of self-improvement. Like wow, that would make a big difference. Another technique that does work, and again, this wouldn't surprise a Seneca or an Epictetus, is picking the right friends. Because friends, as Aristotle put it, good friends, real friends, I'm not talking about the kind of friends you have on Facebook, but real friends are supposed to be a mirror to your soul, as Aristotle puts it, right? So it's somebody who actually cares enough about you that if you're doing something wrong, he's going to say, you might want to think about this. You might want to reconsider that, right? Very few of us, I think, have that kind of friendship. We tend to pick people who are essentially the politicians' equivalent of yes men, right? So people that tell us that we're so good, we're great, et cetera, et cetera. They feed our ego and our narcissism, but that's not a way to improve. That's just a way to become complacent.
You need the friends to tell you the truth bombs, lay them out on you.
At least once in a while. I mean,
yeah. No, I think that's important too, in that maybe when things are going fine and normal, you never question it. But that Epictetus quote that it's in the difficulties where people kind of show themselves who they are. And I find that with friendship as well. Like it's the friends that stand by you during very difficult times, or the friends who stand by you when you're doing really well and you need to be checked down. It's the extremes that you need to foster those friendships for when those moments happen. So they're ready, But with regards to sort of politicians, are there some people that are beyond teaching, like sociopaths? Because it does seem that there's kind of the type of people who are either drawn to power, or the people who rise up in power are the ones who might be beyond the reach. Or can everyone be taught a little bit? I don't know. Being optimistic.
So if the analogy that Protagoras was making with music is correct, and I think there's something to it, in theory at least, everybody can improve. They're not going to play at Carnegie Hall, but they can improve. But there are exceptions, and just like there are people who are completely tone deaf in music, there are people who are the equivalent of ethically tone deaf. And yes, a sociopath would be a good example of that. Now, interestingly, modern research shows that sociopaths are overrepresented in the population in two cases: politicians and people who work on Wall Street, so high finance, which I am sure will not surprise anyone. Right? I mean, those are people who are, in fact, the stereotypical description of a politician or a Wall Streeter is somebody who is in for themselves, hubristic, narcissistic, et cetera, et cetera. So what are we going to do about those people? Well, we make sure that they're not there. I mean, that's the problem is, especially in the case of politicians, there's not much necessarily we can do about Wall Street other than structural reform, but that's a whole different issue. But in the case of politicians, we usually put them into place. But we are the ones that allow them to get to that point. And so again, we go back to the fact that we are cynical and we don't care about character, when in fact caring about character, especially the character of the people you're going to elect, is most important. Look, when there is an election, politicians typically would give you a sort of platform of points that they're going to try to push if elected, right? Or I will do this and that and then at the other. But the reality of politics is that more likely than not, they won't be able to do even half of those things, right? Why so? Well, because politics is about compromise. You're not Marcus Aurelius. You're not an emperor. Once elected, you can't just decide to do whatever the hell you want. You have to compromise with the other side. Here, my favorite example comes from Cicero. So Cicero was this very effective, very interesting, ancient Roman statesman, politician, philosopher, and public advocate. And one of his friends was Cato the Younger, a Stoic role model. Right? Cato was a senator, and he was so concerning with doing the right thing, and his character was so unimpeachable that in Rome, during the Republican Rome, if you were doing something, happened to be doing something not quite ethical, and somebody would point it out to you, a typical response would be, well, not everybody can be a Cato. Right? So Cato was such a role model even then, and it's like that people used him basically as an excuse, like I can't be that high. But Cicero complains about Cato in a letter that he wrote to his friend, to his lifelong friend Atticus. He says, my dear friend, Cato is a wonderful person and we love him to death. But the problem is that he acts and votes in the Senate as if he were living in Plato's Republic and not in the mud of Romulus. A reference to the fact that Roman politics was, of course, complicated, muddy. It was in Plato's Republic. And so the same goes for modern politicians. Sure, you should pay attention to what a politician says he's going to do if elected, but you should also immediately discard more than half of what that platform is about. Well, but if you discard the platform, then on what other criteria are you going to decide whether to vote for somebody or not? Character, I would say. Why? Because if you're picking a wise person, if you're picking a person who has, for instance, practical wisdom, which is one of the 4 cardinal virtues, and which is essentially the ability to navigate complex situations in the best possible way, then that person will be able to readjust their program and their priorities according to the actual situation on the ground. They will be acting like Cicero, not like Cato. They will not be rigid. They would be the kind of people that say, okay, this is what I want to go, this is what I want to do, but at the same time, this is what I can do. This is the reality of the situation, and so I'm going to do that. Well, the only way you can trust somebody that way is if you are a good judge of character, regardless of what they're going to tell us that they're going to do on the electoral campaign.
I was going to ask, so should we create a character test? Is there something we can do to test the character? Because it seems like you say we have to be a good judge of character. So that means the person needs to have the good character themselves to maybe be a good judge of character. And does that mean to judge which politician you like, you have to meet them in person? Like, how do we find out someone's nature?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? So character, of course, ideally can be judged only by a close and continued acquaintance with a person. And of course, we don't have that luxury. We can't, most people don't interact with politicians that much. But part of the answer is the one you just pointed out, which is start working on yourself. Because if you become a person with better character, you're more likely to recognize the telltale signs of somebody else who has a good or a bad character. But also, look, this is really not that difficult in a sense, because although it's very difficult to get to the inner motivations of people, it's hard to tell why people do certain things. You can come up with stories, you can come up with, your theories, but it's hard to tell. Sometimes not even the people themselves know why they're doing certain things. I mean, a lot of modern psychology shows that we are somewhat blind to our own motivations for doing things. But at the same time, we can look at actions, right? We can look at the results, and actions stem from, of course, whatever the inner motivations. In fact, modern behavioral economists will tell you that you shouldn't be paying any attention to what somebody says. You should be paying attention to what they do, right? Which in economic terms is actually works very, very, very well. So for instance, people might tell you that the environment is at the top of their priorities, right? And so if you go by what they tell you, you say, oh, people really care about the environment. But then a behavioral economist will say, oh yeah, so why is it that so few people actually bought the recycling things? Right? Like it looks like they're talking the talk, but they're not actually walking the walk. And that's what matters. That what really matters is walking the walk. So you can apply that criterion to examining politicians. Pay attention to what they're doing more than to what they're saying. So if you catch them, for instance, lying or contradicting themselves in action compared to what they say they're going to do, well, that should be enough to disqualify them. Right? So
we wouldn't have any politicians left, though.
That's exactly right. We would have an overall of current politicians. The current political class will be almost completely gone. I don't think entirely, because I don't want to name names because then people get into partisanship, and that's not the point here. There are good people on both aisles of the political side or the political spectrum, I think. But I do think there are people who actually are there, and I couldn't name names if I won't get partisan or accuse of partisanship, that are actually honestly trying to do the right thing. But yeah, you're right. The majority of them doesn't look like it.
Yeah.
And so the bar should be at least at the level of, look, my friend, if I catch you doing things that are quite the opposite of what you say you want to do, or that I think you should be doing, then you're out. One strike and you're out, because I don't have the patience. I don't have the time to give you second chances and third chances and so on and so forth. Instead, we actually do quite the opposite. Most people just seem not to care about how badly politicians behave, because we give ourselves the excuse of cynicism, right? We say, oh, well, of course they do that if they're politicians. Well, but that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't hold them accountable, yes, they will. You're essentially selecting for bad people, people with bad character, and of course they will do what they're doing.
I like the test. Would you let them babysit your kid for 2 hours? If you wouldn't even trust them with a child for 2 hours, it's probably not a good person.
That's right. Instead, what kind of test do you hear, right? In more than one American election, do you hear, oh, that candidate for president is the kind of guy that I would hang around at a bar and have a beer with? It's like, really? That's your test? You want, for president of the United States, you want somebody you could be your buddy drinking a beer? I don't think so. Drinking a beer at a bar tells you exactly nothing about the character of a person. You're absolutely right. Whether, on the other hand, you would trust that person with your kids for even an hour, now that would tell you quite a bit.
To go back to Socrates and Alcibiades, if we're trying to learn about virtue and character, and we've talked about role models and such, why Alcibiades? Why pick a failed example?
Well, because we do learn a lot from failed examples, or in fact, arguably even more than from successes, because there's a lot of things that might contribute to success, and it's often easier to identify what actually caused the failure. In fact, in the book, I don't just talk, I start out with Socrates and Alcibiades, but then I go into analyzing a number of other examples in the ancient world. Plato's attempt to influence Dionysius II, the tyrant of Syracuse, which failed and almost cost Plato his life. Aristotle and Alexander the Great, that one arguably succeeded too much, because Aristotle was trying to convince Alexander that it would be good to create a sort of a pan-Hellenistic world so that, unify all the Greeks. Well, Alexander liked the idea so much that he tried to create, an empire that covered the entire world, not just Greece. So arguably, he went well beyond what his teacher was suggesting. Seneca, as we know, succeeded with Nero for a few years. There was the first 5 years of Nero's reign are referred to by scholars as the Quinquennium Neronis, the Neronian 5 years, and it was a pretty good time for Rome. This was a time where Rome was prosperous, but then of course Nero started getting more and more unhinged, and at some point Seneca started to distance himself and tried unsuccessfully to retire. So many of the examples that we have of philosophers trying to influence politicians are not good. They're not successful. And I think the common thread there is that in almost all cases, the prime matter was not good. That is, Plato was dealing with Dionysius, who was already a tyrant. He was already way beyond. He was a sociopath. He was already way beyond, help. Nero and Alexander were younger. They were about 17 years old when respectively Seneca and Aristotle tried to shape them. But you could argue that in those cases as well, most of the education had already been done, and so that it's the matter to which these philosophers were working that was simply not adequate. We have examples of better success when a philosopher becomes a statesman, or a statesman practices philosophy. Marcus Aurelius is the obvious example, but we have also Cato the Younger. As I was saying earlier, he didn't become an emperor, but he was a highly influential politician, and he was certainly cultivating virtue. Cicero himself is a very good example of that. Julian the Apostate, the last pagan Roman emperor, was also he died young, unfortunately, so we don't know what he might have been able to accomplish. But in that short period in which he was alive and in charge, it seemed like he was doing things the right way. So I think there is, and that's part of the point in my book. That is, the quest for character starts with ourselves, not with telling other people what to do. So for every Seneca who tries to teach a Nero, there is a Cato or a Marcus Aurelius who actually teach themselves, and they are far more effective than in the first case.
Wow, that's fascinating. Would you say that, the founding fathers were maybe a positive example of that? Or there were a lot of love of philosophy there. I mean, Madison and Jefferson.
Yes, I agree. The founding fathers of the United States were certainly philosophers in the sense that we're talking about, again, non-academic philosophers, but people who were concerned with ethical self-improvement. And yes, I know that these days all we talk about is the fact that Washington had slaves and Jefferson had slaves. That's true, and it needs to be acknowledged. There were certainly inconsistencies in the big inconsistencies in the lives of these people. Nevertheless, their ideals were informed by philosophy, and they were striving to do their best. Washington read Epictetus, and he was famous. He was familiar with Cato the Younger. Thomas Jefferson considered himself an Epicurean, and he donated his personal copy of Epictetus's Enchiridion to the University of Virginia Library. Benjamin Franklin, all of these people were actually in that category. Things started going the wrong way, about a generation or so later, when the first populist politicians started getting elected president. And then, Andrew Jackson was the first example, arguably, of those. And sure enough, that was the beginning of a catastrophe, because they really did not act. They didn't even try to act virtuously. They were not even concerned with that. So yeah, I think that the founding fathers of the American Republic are a good example. Unfortunately, the current crop of politicians in the United States is doesn't quite measure up, broadly speaking, to that level.
To just refer to one of your previous points about the importance of, say, a role model, we recently had an article outlining the Washington's modeling himself very specifically after the Roman Cincinnatus, and the ability to go to war and have power and then to drop it, and he like purposely modeled himself on that. So maybe we need to remind current politicians to find better role models.
Exactly. I mean, Washington, people, even a lot of Americans don't seem to realize that Washington was this close from becoming a king. That people at the time really thought that you should be president for life, which wouldn't have been that different from being a king. But he knew that, he said, no, this is not the right thing. We're doing this whole experiment precisely to abolish monarchy. And I don't want to become a de facto monarch. And you're right. His example and role model was Cincinnatus, who did exactly that. He was called back from retirement during the Roman Republic because there was an emergency. He was given powers to resolve that emergency. And as soon as he'd done that, he said, okay, I'm done. I relinquish my powers. I'm going back to cultivate my fields.
It's amazing. And Massimo, you've given me so much time of yours, but I want to ask one last question, if I may. And this is a little bit more about yourself with regards to, and this was actually a question I had one of my readers, when I mentioned your book, asked me, so I thought it would be a good one, that in 2021, you said that you had a bit of a shift of interest away from Stoicism, and that you're towards a new synthesis, something you called Neosepticism. Would you be able to just explain a little bit about how that works, and if this is sort of reflected in your newest book?
Yeah, it's a little bit reflected in the new book. I moved away from Stoicism, but not in the sense that I left Stoicism entirely. I mean, Stoicism is still, in my mind, one of the best philosophies of life that have ever been articulated, and I still very much practice that philosophy to some extent. However, I was also influenced over the last few years by reading Cicero. Cicero is one of our major sources on Stoicism. In fact, several of his books are how we know about Stoicism in the first place. The Stoic Paradoxes, the Tusculan Disputations, and a number of others. It's because, unfortunately, many of the original Stoic texts did not survive. And Cicero was known for being a friendly critic of Stoicism. Right? So he didn't consider himself a Stoic, and he was definitely in De Finibus Bonorum et Malorum, for instance, on the ends of good and evil, which I think is a great title for a book. He actually presents in one book, in one chapter, he presents the Stoic system in detail. In fact, he has his friend Cato the Younger basically presenting the Stoic system. But then in the following chapter, he kind of demolishes a lot of the points that the Stoics have built. So the result of it was that Cicero lived his life pretty much like a Stoic. His ethics especially was informed by Stoicism. But he considered himself a skeptic, meaning somebody whose attitude is, I don't have the truth with a capital T. I only have notions that appear to me probable at the moment. And so I'm going to act on those notions as if they were true. But in the back of my mind, I keep open the possibility that I could be wrong, and that therefore I could change. I might need to change my approach. As a politician, he's often criticized, even in modern times, for being sort of a flip-flopper, right? Changing direction and going first with one allegiance and then with another. But in fact, one of his biographers has pointed out that's exactly what you expect from an effective politician. You have to shift your allegiances depending on the situation. You cannot be rigid about things. But Cicero always had the same good intention in mind. He wanted to save the Roman Republic. And so he was doing whatever happened to be opportune in order to pursue that goal. So Cicero has become in recent years a good model for me. He was also, unlike the Stoic role models that are a little bit rigid, as I was saying earlier about Cato, he's also a very human character, right? If you read his biography, either the actual biography or there's 3 books of a fictional biography that are out there that are very, very well written and very historically informed, you get the sense that he was an actual human being. He made mistakes. He was striving for virtue, but he also was weak in certain aspects. He didn't like, for instance, physical violence and threat of violence. He was a little bit of a squeamish from that perspective. And yet, when he died, he did so in a very courageous manner. And, he was a very loyal friend to his lifelong friend Atticus. And in fact, when he wrote a book on friendship, you can see that he really believed in what he was saying, because he actually had example of his own practice with his close friend. But at the same time, he also made mistakes. He also, at some point didn't act in the most courageous or virtuous way. So he's a much more relatable and much more flexible of an individual. And so that's why I'm much more open to a skeptically informed Stoicism rather than a straightforward version of it.
Well, I'm in accordance. I mean, I quite like a lot of Stoicism, and I think there's so many wonderful elements of it that can be extremely helpful for people. But you don't have to take everything in one package. Like, I mean, I'm never going to have cold showers. I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen. I like being an eclectic. I think that's a good term for Cicero, and I think that's
exactly.
It can be more applicable to our modern world as well, because there are going to be some elements that, they're going to have to adapt to our current situation. So
That's right.
it's interesting, though. I like seeing philosophers like yourself sort of evolve and at different times, rather than just stick to one niche, to continue thinking and always adapting the philosophy.
Well, philosophy in the sense, again, that we're talking about as a philosophy of life and that sort of the love of wisdom is supposed to be a process, not a certain destination. And I'm done, because otherwise it becomes a little too close to a religion. Right?
Yeah.
And Epictetus was not Jesus, and the discourses is not scripture. So if I disagree, I mean, I love Epictetus. He's made a major impact on my life, but there are certain things that I look at my friend Epictetus and I say, no, I don't think so.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Massimo. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I've been absolutely thoroughly enjoying reading Quest for Character. I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy, and it's been really interesting too, kind of doing a deep dive into Alcibiades and that relationship. So I highly recommend it to everybody. And do you know exact date that it's coming out?
It will come out September 25th. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Well, I'll have links to that, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Sorry, I'm just going to stop recording, but there we go.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks. Please go to classicalwisdom.substack.com to learn more about our work and to sign up for our free newsletter. To learn more about Massimo and his excellent books, please go to https://massimopigliucci.org.